I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And I'm joined now, as always, by San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Great to have you back here on the program, Liz. And to start off, we have an update on a case we discussed last week as a judge has sentenced the San Antonio killer who cut up and burned a man's remains to life in prison. Tell me about these new details.
Yes, Chance, it's good to be back. And we will be finishing up the case of Daniel Moreno Lopez, who, as you said, was convicted Friday of killing his girlfriend's cousin in a grisly beating, then chopping up his body and taking his limbs and burning them in a backyard barbecue pit in 2014. So I think when we were talking last time, we had gone through, this heinous crime that happened on September 30th, 2014, when Lopez, who's 32 years old, killed Jose Luis Menchaca, who was 35, after Daniel Lopez and his cousin, Gabriel Moreno, beat Menchaca with aluminum baseball bats, strangled him and suffocated him, and then they cut up and burned his body. And this was all done in retaliation for a drug deal that went bad between Lopez and Menchaca. The two men got into some sort of altercation, and Menchaca actually stabbed Daniel Lopez. Not, obviously he was hurt, but he did not suffer any major damage from that. So this happened about 2 days before the killing. So that's how that particular thing went down.
And then last week, Liz, I know we hadn't gotten to the final verdict in sentencing, but we talked about all the extra attention that was being placed due to some what I guess was talk about whether or not there might be some antics during the end of this trial. There was a lot of heightened security as a result, but actually, it looks like none of those fears were realized.
Chance, it was really kind of interesting. This hearing lasted for 3 days, and a lot of it had to do with the fact, of course, that in previous proceedings that went on for Daniel Lopez and for his cousin Gabriel Moreno, a co-defendant in this case, the men were able to smuggle shanks and other things from the jail into the courtroom. And when Daniel Lopez actually in June was convicted of murder, he attempted to punch his defense attorney, J. Charles Bunk. And at that time, during the verdict in that case, there were at least, a dozen or more Bexar County Sheriff's deputies, bailiffs, in the courtroom just to make sure that, both sides in the gallery would not get into any sort of, altercation. But mostly because of what was going on in front of the gallery, between the judge's bench and where the lawyers sit. And this was, very apparent then. Well, when this sentencing hearing began last week, eerily on Halloween, there were a lot of security personnel in that courtroom. In fact, the Bexar County District Attorney's Office, the day before this hearing started, urged non-essential personnel to stay out of the courtroom. So in the end, though, none of this appeared to really, thank goodness, nothing happened in the courtroom that everybody had prepared for. So, kudos to people who, made the plan to make sure that no one in the courtroom was going to be hurt. But this was an interesting case, Chance, because they had Lopez in the jury box by himself, surrounded by sheriff's deputies the entire time. And there were actually deputies in there who had long guns. They were SWAT officers, actually, from the sheriff's office who had long guns, and they kept their attention completely on Daniel Lopez during this time in the courtroom. In fact, it really was just the attorneys involved, media members, and lots of law enforcement, uniformed and undercover. So we did not end up having a big situation, thank goodness, in that courtroom.
Yeah, and as you correctly point out, preparation is always key. So, you hope nothing ever happens, but of course you prepare sometimes for the worst. And I think that's what they were doing with this specific case. Something that I want to ask you about, Liz, we often talk about victim impact statements. Did that happen at all during this trial?
Yes, this chance, we had a very, very good victim impact statement here. Is we've talked about on the podcast before this case many times. And in one of the people, there was only one victim impact statement. And this came from Jose Luis Menchaca's girlfriend, Sylvia Flores. And if you'll recall, she was with Menchaca when they went to the home on Hillwood Drive to see Menchaca's cousin, Candy Dominguez, who was the girlfriend of Daniel Lopez at that time. And when Sylvia and Jose Luis Menchaca walked into the room, Sylvia Flores testified that the two men began beating him with baseball bats. And while this is happening, she is in the room. She was actually taken from that room and put into a restroom, and she was held there against her will for several days. They stripped her of her clothing and they tied her up in a shower and left her there for several days. So when Judge Ron Rangel sentenced Lopez to life in prison, Sylvia Flores got up to give her victim impact statement to Lopez. And Chance, her voice was shaking and her hands were trembling. And she read from a prepared statement, but the gist of it all was that she said to him that Lopez took away someone that she loved. And when she testified, she talked about Menchaca as being someone who was like her protector. They were together all the time, and they had a real love for each other. And, she told Lopez that ever since he was killed and ever since her experience being held captive, that she has had to be on medication, on daily medication. She's had to attend numerous doctor's appointments each month. And because she was, terrorized, Sylvia Flores is 29 years old, and she had testified before that she had a heroin addiction. And her lawyer, Andrew Freilich, who stood behind her as she made this victim impact statement, while she's also flanked by the prosecution team of Josh Summers and Matthew Ludwig, Andrew Freilich says that he believes that she has just come a really long way. She's gotten much stronger. And the fact that she was able to stand up and face him, even though she trembled and shook a little bit, was really a huge thing for Sylvia Flores, because she obviously is suffering some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder from this horrible experience. So that was quite the scene in court when she stood up and gave that.
And then, Liz, this might be the time when I'd say, well, we've wrapped up this case and maybe we'll never discuss it again on the podcast, but I know there are two co-defendants. What happens with them now?
Yes. Daniel Lopez's cousin, Gabriel Moreno, who's 34 years old, he will be retried. As you'll recall, his case went to trial last March, and it ended in a hung jury after jurors deliberated for 4 days and could not, decide on guilt for Gabriel Moreno. So as of this time, court records show that Moreno has a November 28th trial date. So we'll see at the end of this month whether or not that case will go. And we will, and if it does, we will definitely be discussing it again. And also, Daniel Lopez's former girlfriend, as I mentioned earlier, Candy Dominguez, who was the cousin of Jose Luis Menchaca, is also awaiting trial. Now, her situation is a little different because initially when Daniel Lopez went to trial the first time last year, and that case ended in a mistrial, it was because Candy Dominguez revealed from the witness stand after she talked about what they had done during the killing of Menchaca. She also told the court that she had been recently diagnosed as bipolar and schizophrenic, which came as a surprise to Charles Bunk, the defense attorney. And at that point, he asked for a mistrial, and Judge Rangel granted it because Charles Bunk told him, had he known that she suffered from mental illness, he would have prepared his voir dire, his jury selection differently, and of course his case differently as well. So, when you're waiting on psychiatric evaluations, sometimes those can take a really long time. So we'll see what happens with Candy Dominguez, who is also awaiting trial. So, yep, we will be discussing this case again.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. Still got plenty of time left in today's episode, Elizabeth. Let's jump to a different case involving another San Antonio man, as a former ballet San Antonio dancer has been found not guilty of sexual assault. This was a case that got a lot of press.
Yes, it did, Chance. This actually happened in 2017, and we wrote about it earlier this year. And this is the case of against Hugo Rodriguez, who's 27 years old. He was once a rising star with Ballet San Antonio, which is the company that is based at the Tobin Center for the Performing Arts here in San Antonio. So one of his fellow dancers accused him of rape in March of 2017 after several of the dancers had gone out to a friend's house for a party, and then they decided they were going to go to a bar in San Antonio. And after this happened, the accuser, who we're not going to name because the San Antonio Express News does not name victims of sexual assault, the accuser went out with the rest of her coworkers with Rodriguez as part of a group to a bar, and they drank. And she decided at some point that she was going to go home. So she and her roommate, who was also a ballet dancer with a company, decided to go home. This was about 1:00 in the morning in March of 2017. And sometime around 4:30 or so in the morning, Hugo Rodriguez shows up at the apartment, and this is after texting the accuser and asking if he could go over. And then he ends up going to the apartment, but the accuser has not answered any of his texts because she's asleep. Her roommate ends up letting Rodriguez in, who asks to sleep on the couch. And they had they had had a history of, this was a very, very close-knit group of friends, part of this ballet company. They did a lot of things together. They hung out. And so, the roommate testified that she felt it was fine for him to stay at the apartment. So at some point after she let him in and she goes back to bed, Hugo Rodriguez went into the bedroom of his accuser, and the accuser said she woke up with him having sex with her. So she went to police and went and got checked at a hospital. But after a week of this trial, last Friday, right around the same time as Lopez's sentencing was happening, a jury found Hugo Rodriguez not guilty of sexual assault, of these allegations that were made by the former ballerina with the company.
So, Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, most of the prosecution's case revolved around witness statements themselves rather than physical evidence or anything like that. Is that correct?
Yes, Chance. I mean, these cases are really hard to prove when there are no witnesses. And also, you come into a situation where the accuser and the accused are part of a very large group of friends that actually hang out together. And the accuser and the accused had, were part of this group, and they were known to hang out in these particular settings. In this particular case, a lot of these witnesses who testified appeared to do what defense attorneys accused them of, embellishing the details, because after the incident happened, the accuser, her roommate, and several other friends who had been out that night with the accuser and the accused as part of a group gave statements to police. But then when they came and they testified, there were a lot of details that were not in the initial reports that were discussed in court and that were brought up by defense attorneys James Tochi and Kelly McGinnis. And, that really makes it, really hard for, I guess, to see kind of what happened, because again, there were no witnesses. And there were other things as well that even when the accuser testified herself, prosecutor Anna Scott and her fellow prosecutor Clint Malloy asked her questions. And one of the things that did come up as well was that the accuser had told some members of law enforcement that she was worried about what was going to happen to Rodriguez because, she was worried as to what the consequences would be going down the road. Now, we heard in trial through some experts that, there's no uniform way that victims of sexual assault act. They might scream and holler and, fight and do those sorts of things. In other cases, they may be so shocked or startled or traumatized that they don't do anything or say anything. One of the things that the accuser in this case testified to was that she woke up while he was having sex with her. She told him to stop, and then she asked him about his girlfriend and said that this was wrong. And that was one of the things that the defense really paid attention to, because they were countering that, well, if she felt like she was being raped, why ask about his girlfriend? So I think when you add all of these things together, I think you have a jury And in this case, you had a jury that was pretty much evenly divided. My colleague and friend Bruce Selcraig covered this case while I was in another case, but I want to say that this jury had about maybe 7. I think the makeup was about 7 women to 5 men, if memory serves me. But these types of things, when you don't have a witness, and you have a situation like this where, and the accuser was very, very solemn, and she had this look on her face that was just one that it's really kind of hard to describe, but you could definitely tell that being on that witness stand was not where she wanted to be. So I think that, sexual assault cases are very, very hard to prove in these particular situations where you have accuser and accused who know each other. They've been hanging out together. One of the things that came out when the defense began presenting their witnesses, and they recalled the accuser, was that they had actually made out at a bar that night before the incident occurred. And it was something that when she testified with the state, that she did not admit. So when she came back, called by defense attorneys, and they asked her that question, and she remembered that she had been kissing the defendant that night at a bar before she left, that probably gave the defense enough that they needed to go back to the jury in closing arguments, and they basically called her a liar. So you put all of those things together, and it gives the jury enough to where, in this case, that they acquitted him.
And a big thank you, as always, to San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.